Well, I want to thank Laurent so much for what he's done and opening this dialogue up to so many different disciplines is what's been needed for so long. And I I wanted to say that can you see these flowers? These flowers were given to me out of sympathy. No one's ever given anything to me out of sympathy in this field ever before. Uh, and of course, I'm very sad at Kanzi's passing. But not only did I get these flowers, I got condolences from around the world. The first one was from Tetsuro, and that meant the world to me, Tetsuro. This has been a long, 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 difficult journey for Kanzi and for me and for the other bonobos, Matata, Pamanisha, Nathan, Alikia, Maisha, Clara, Molly. There have been others, and there have been many chimpanzees. And before there were chimpanzees in Atlanta, there were chimpanzees like Washoe and others, Bowie and Bruno, that I worked with in Oklahoma. And like many of you, when you have this experience, it's not something you can put in a scientific article and count how many times X happened to you, because X happens only once, and then X plus Y, and then X plus Y plus Z, and then it sort of becomes transcendental and it becomes quantum, and it's not like you have any way to relate to what's happening to you except to say this is the closest thing to human that's ever happened. And that's why it's transformative and inspiring. But of course, there are not very many apes in the world, and there are even fewer captive apes in the world. And the ones that are wild are disappearing. And it's very hard to get to see them. And you don't know how if you can interact with them. Jane Goodall followed them for a very long time. And before she did that, uh, nobody really even paid any attention to them. We were a very egocentric species. And it took me a long time to come to where I'll try to tell you today. But I've had more opportunities than any of you. Hundreds of thousands of millions of more opportunities day and night with all different species and including orangutans and gorillas and gibbons and many macaques. So I can't just put my experience into you. All I can do is kind of point the way, like, the Buddha pointing at the moon, and everybody tries to look at the end of the finger. And that's the problem. Because when you have more experiences, you suddenly realize, hey, wait a minute, maybe I missed something you were trying to tell me, Kanzi. And you feel that with Lana, and you feel that with Sherman, and you feel that with Austin. And then pretty soon you begin to wonder, is this problem me? What's the problem here? And you start to realize that, let's see if I can shift this one slide. This is Kanzi here. And I'm saying, what's going on and why? Is this a Franz Kafka moment? Why can I not see Kanzi in 11 years? Why can't I call him on the phone? Why can't I even send him a card and see if he'll draw something and send it back? I mean, what's really wrong here? Why is this happening? And Kanzi sort of thinks, never get to be just who I was. Don't know quite why. Waiting for a day when the sky ain't gray. Because Kanzi had to put up with a lot in the last 10 years. And even before, he had to put up with my stupidity, but at least I knew I had some stupidity. And I was trying to be aware of that at every moment. And I was aware, not only am I asking a question about species differences, I'm really asking a female question mostly. I'm asking a question about rearing and culture, and what does the first 3 or 4 years of life do? Because I was co-rearing Kanzi with his mother, who happened to want to co-rear Kanzi with me. She just happened to want to do that, or I wouldn't have been doing it. And Kanzi happened to want to do that, or I wouldn't be doing it. I wasn't an experimenter who said, I'm going to be famous. And I was just an experimenter who was trying to learn from the closest living relatives we had. Why wouldn't we do that? Why would we do anything else? I couldn't understand why other people didn't want to do that. And I happened to be doing it at the time that Jane Goodall happened to be going to Africa. And I happened to be doing that in Oklahoma, at the Oklahoma Primate Research Institute, where they had between 30 and 40 chimpanzees, and many of them had been reared in circuses and zoos and human homes as pets, and just all different kinds of, one was reared in a children's zoo, a petting zoo. So they had all different kinds of experiences. And I went there and I was just stunned. And on the third day, I said, I'm staying here till I get my degree, because I was on my way to Harvard and I was going to work with B.F. Skinner because I wanted to know how humans become the way they are. And I said, if I want to know how humans become the way they are, I need to be studying these beings. And one of the first things that happened to me after I'd been there at least a year, and I thought I knew something about chimps. I was reading all the literature. I thought I was looking at all these different backgrounds. I thought I knew something. And then I put my finger in where I had before with this circus chimp, and she bit it off. And 1 year later, I thought, oh, I really learned from this lesson. Now I really know chimpanzees. So I put this finger in and I can't straighten it. Now, I don't know why I didn't stop after that, but but I didn't. Let me see if I can. So for a long time, Western Europeans thought, we were the top human species on the planet. And we were going around looking at all of these other kinds of species here. This is an early pygmy chimp. This is an early fauna chimp. Is this an early human? This human was put on display in a zoo where they let it get cold at night because they didn't think he felt cold. We have a lot of trouble in understanding what culture is and when it starts. And it starts before birth and it goes across generations. So we're building across generations. And if we want to understand who we are, we have to understand what is the process of building across generations. And it involves early rearing. And most of that rearing is done by females. And even though there was this great revolution and males started participating in it, most males don't really do that much. My son is an exception, an extraordinary exception. And he understands differences between males and females in a way maybe only Kanzi did. And Kanzi was his brother. So there are these basic things about humanity that we're kind of ignoring and missing. And so I want to move to this slide. Where's my
You
cursor?
should be able to. Your cursor is here, but
Yeah.
yeah, then you should
this
just, but you should just be able to do that.
Oh, okay. So this is Kanzi and this is Laurent and this is Tico. And when Laurent came to the lab, he wasn't another scientist. He was that and more. And Tico understood it, and Yoda understood it, and Kanzi understood it. They can tell when you're paying attention to them and when you're not, when you're taking them seriously and when you're not, and when you give them the credit that they deserve and when you don't. And I was a person who didn't always do that because I was a person who, like every other person, underestimated them and thought they were primitive. Now, I showed you a picture of more primitive humans and what we thought of them for a long time. And so I started out with that background and I thought that too. But I knew, even because of what Kanzi and I had already done, that when Laurent came, he was paying attention. And they knew immediately he was paying attention. And they could tell whether people followed their micro glances. Pam Anisha would make a point like that. Did you happen to see me point? Did you happen to see me look over there? You don't even see if I'm looking over there and you're not following my glance. You're hopeless. And Laurent tells the story about, Pam Anisha realizing that he couldn't follow the lexigram. So she carefully closes up the keyboard and she sets it down and she tries to find some other way. So when you realize you're dealing with a species like that, you realize you've got to change. If you don't change, your data ain't going to change.
Speaking of which,
You're
can
going
you
to
move back
it
into the
in same
camera?
way. Your data isn't going to change. Thank you, Shane. So I remember the most poignant lesson I had was when Kanzi was about probably 6 or 7. And I was supposed to go to a conference and speak about my latest data with Kanzi. And one of the things, because we did language all the time and we made videotapes all the time and we directed plays all the time and we just did things all the time. People ran around the lab, making the lab real life. The real life was the life we created in the lab. And one of the things that Rose Sevchek did one day, one of my students, was run in when I was getting ready to go to a presentation, and she said, "I'm making a tape for Kanzi. What would you like? What would you like to tell Kanzi?" And I said, "Well, I have to go. I have to go to give a presentation. Tell Kanzi that when I come back, I'll be sure to bring him something. I'll be sure to bring him something special." And then I went on to the presentation. I was gone for about a week or something like that. And I came back and I went into the lab to see Kanzi, and he was just banging, 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 and he was screaming at me. And he never done that. And I couldn't figure out why normally I just walk right in the cage with Kanzi. I was like, I don't really think I should do this. And I kept trying to ask him, what's wrong? What's wrong? I was asking him. Well, he was mad. Finally, I thought back and I thought, what is the last thing I said to him before I left? And I said on a video, I wasn't seeing him. I was looking at Rose and I was saying, I will bring you something, Kanzi. That's the last thing I said to Kanzi, but not in his presence. I didn't even know if he'd seen the video. Well, he had. And he had planned that I bring him something, and he saw me, I walk in with nothing. So he's mad. Because not so much because I didn't bring anything, but because I didn't remember. I didn't think about what was important to him from his perspective, that he even had that degree of memory. And so I just turned to him and I said, Kanzi, are you mad because I forgot what I said? And he goes, yes. And he screams and he puts his tummy up, and then I go in and we hug. And, it wasn't that I didn't bring him a thing. It was that I forgot. So I had to start trying to remember everything I did or said in his presence and the other bonobos' presence. So I want to move down one more slide to Nancy. You were able to hear Nancy talk. You were able to hear Shane talk a little bit about the Buddhist perspective. In the future, I think a lot of people are going to be wondering what I'm wondering now that I've been locked out. What is so important about any of this to lock out all these people? Why are they locking out Shane? Why can't he go talk to Kanzi? Why can't Liz's daughter do the same kind of thing, or her children? These are third generation pan-homo beings. And they say, oh, Sue's done something so terrible, we can't say what it is. It's so terrible. Well, what's really happening is that as people began to think about what chimps were, Kohler was one of the first, and he already accredited them with reasoning and insight, did all these experiments in about 1 year in 1915. And everybody already knew. And then he established Gestalt psychology in Germany. And everybody understood that there were these beings that had these capabilities, but they didn't know if it was language. So Yerkes established a colony in Orange Park, Florida, and he raised 2 chimpanzees. Well, one was a bonobo and one was a chimpanzee, but then bonobos weren't a special species. So he raised a 2 or 3-year-old bonobo and a 2 or 3-year-old chimpanzee together, and he called them Chim, which was the bonobo's name, and Pansy, which was the name of the other species. And like the genetic data shows, like Linnaeus found, these 2 species are very closely related to us. And you know how they got so closely related to us? 2 of their chromosomes were put together and made one of our chromosomes. So does that normally happen in genetics? No. What happened? Did God come down and put together 2 chromosomes out of 2 beings that 2.5 million years ago were like us? Or who knows what happened? It's very strange that it happens. It does challenge all the religious issues, and especially it challenged them more because so far, if you take the reports, the chimpanzees are murderous. They eat each other. They create war. It's not all the wonderful good things that Goodall seemed to find. But then Goodall had to follow them a lot, and they didn't always want to be followed. If you're trying to get your food and somebody's always following you, you finally give up. And now there are people, 4, 5, 6 following them around with their cameras just as close as this, and they're putting it on Netflix. And all those chimpanzees are fighting. And you go and you look at the bonobos that Dr. Kano studied. He rode his bicycle across Africa, across all of the Congo, to find out where he should study the bonobos. And he found this one place he should study the bonobos. And they are not murderous. They don't have war. They're very peaceful. They, like the peace dove that Kanzi made, that's kind of the basis of their philosophy. And they share everything. They don't just share a monkey that they rip apart, that, you know, they hunted together. They share all plant food. They share everything. So these 2 species were so different when Robert Yerkes looked at them that you kind of wonder, how did these species, they look alike, they live in similar areas, but they're so dramatically different. So I was compelled, after I studied language with Lana and Sherman and Austin, and some bonobos were brought from the wild to Yerkes to try to study bonobos. Everything about them was so different, but because they looked so much alike, everybody thought they were the same species, but their behaviors were completely different. And their vocalizations are completely different. So this slide says the human politics of humans studying the politics of chimpanzees and bonobos. If you become a student in primatology, the first thing you're told is don't ever anthropomorphize. Well, here, this is a species that's the most closely related to us on the planet. And you can only be a good scientist if you don't draw any relationships between that species and yourself. That's the first thing you're told. And one of the first things that in the trial that Lindsay talked about was an objection to Laurent, was that he wasn't trained as a primatologist. Therefore, he was making some mistakes in that he might look at the similarities between, actually look at them between ourselves and others. So Yerkes tried to do that, and he wrote the first book, which was called Almost Human. And now there's like 25 books about sort of related topics, and they're all called Almost Human. And there's, you know, a new movie out about King Kong and Godzilla. So all of this is in us, like Nancy says. It's in us in some deep way that you can't even explain how deep it is. But the next thing that happened was World War II. And in World War II, lots of terrible experiments were done with human beings. And after that, instead of studying chimp behavior, the Yerkes complex was brought from Orange Park, Florida, to Emory University. And all of the work became biomedical. And when you really want to study something, you don't want just a culture. You want as close to a human as you can get. And as close to a human as you can get is a chimpanzee or a bonobo. So it became, in 1970, a great goal to have primate centers throughout the United States with as many primates as possible and as many chimpanzees as possible. And when I got there to Yerkes, they were incinerating several chimpanzees a week. They all had tattoos on them. There were lots of behavioral scientists. There were lots of scientists that, because of the previous experiments where they put the chimpanzees in little isolation cages, they just went around and drove themselves to drink because of what they had actually done to the chimpanzees. And chimpanzees are taken from their mothers at birth and put in a nursery. So I thought, well, we're at least keeping Sherman and Austin and Lana out of the terrible Yerkes nursery. Things were really difficult there, but they're difficult because we're trying to use them to understand our bodies. We're not trying to use them to understand our minds. We're trying to use them to understand our bodies, and we're viewing our bodies as piecemeal things. So is that better or worse? I leave that up to somebody else to understand. But I think did I bump something?
Yes.
Okay. So this just goes to the next two slides. Just quickly detail 40 years of research. So we can just look at these quickly and note that the work has been in the Natural Museum of Natural History. It's been a Smithsonian exhibit. I was invited to apply, well, not apply, to go interview for the Nobel Prize, but of course I couldn't because I was taking care of bonobos and chimpanzees. I've been taking care of them every day until I was locked out. So I just want to say very quickly that there's a lot of reasons. You want me to?
I mean,
Okay.
people want to see you.
Okay.
Just that's our camera.
Okay. So in terms of the human experience, we have learned a lot. We've learned it pretty fast. The human history is that we've made war, we've been destructive, we've been hateful, we've been evil. but also we've reached for the heights. We have both of those influences in us all the time. And if we would like to really reach the heights, we might just think that we need to consider a little more clearly and closely what it is another species, at least two other species, have been doing in their evolution, what they've been coming through. We took a turn when we decided to keep our fires going. They made fires too, according to the legends in Wamba. They learned to make fires. We learned to make fires. They chose to let their fires go out and follow the ways of nature. We chose to build huts. So we turned our nests in the sky upside down and we built the huts and we started bringing things to us instead of going to find things out in nature. And this creates two different brain sets. One where you're organizing things into material categories and getting things materially and with reason and logic put into the same categories. And then when you get something like a written system, you can build all this up into even a civilization. If you follow the ways of nature and you just put your fires out or you let them go out, then you have to figure out what's going on. And you can't do that by just wandering around and then you find the food. If you have 100 individuals or 400 individuals, you can think of us going out and trying to find a restaurant. You can't do that. You have to listen to the other beings in the forest. They have to communicate with you, and the fruit may be only ripe for 1 or 2 days. And so you have to figure out if you go this place, and then where's all the other fruit going to be ripe? It's the quintessential traveling salesman problem. And you need the whole forest to help you figure out how to do that. And you need to be in sync with it, and you need to be able to communicate with it. So when I went to the wild and I saw what the bonobos were doing in the wild, that was as awe-inspiring for me as anyone who would come to my lab and see what the bonobos were doing in my lab. Because there was real bonobo intelligence, and they built it around a non-material culture and a non-material culture of peace and sharing. One problem had to do with sex. So I tried to write some papers about this and talk about this. Well, you can't do that. You just can't do that. It's too embarrassing. So we take all this negative stuff and we stuff it in and we call it Gigi rubbing or something, and we think that our sex is like their sex and we're ashamed of our sex. So they should be ashamed of their sex and they're not ashamed of their sex. So what's wrong with them? We take our glasses and we just put them on them until we can't see them. They vanish. All the good that's there vanishes. And everybody thinks, well, Sue wants them to go out and everybody just have free sex and be hippie and, and it's not really, that's not really what's going on there. And we haven't really been able to understand what's going on there. But I can tell you from walking amongst a group of bonobos, 5, 7, 8, 9, 10, 3 generations, that the one thing you need is total honesty. You need purity. You need to be, everything needs to be straight. You don't need to make something look like it isn't. You don't want to be deceptive. If you don't want to have aggression against you, then you need to treat everybody with love. You need to be pure. And if you're not, and most of us are not, because we're brought up as humans not to be that way. Our culture puts that in us. And it's not easy to get it out. It's not easy. So you can make a mistake. And Matata didn't make very many mistakes. And you have to learn if you're going to walk among a group of individuals that have spent a lot of time perfecting their non-material culture. Let's call it spirituality. If they want to, if you want to be able to walk among them and understand, do they have a real language? You need to be able to seek that kind of purity yourself, because the bonobos have managed to do that. They've managed to create a culture. That doesn't mean, and I don't want to say, that we should destroy our technology, destroy our everything that makes us comfortable. But we need to look at these other species, and we need to look at their all of the aspects of their culture, not just language as we define it, not just tools as we define it. They've learned enough of that to show us that, yeah, look what we can do in one generation. Now we have the second generation and the third generation bonobo there. What would they tell us? The second and third generation humans are different. I think the bonobos would be different as well. And I think we need to have a cross-disciplinary perspective like Laurent has. But because my son is here, and because as a scientist, I couldn't hire him in the lab, although he grew up with Kanzi. I couldn't really talk about him, unless I measured everything he did. And he thought that, it was crazy that I was having to work, that his mother was having to work to prove that Kanzi had language. It made no sense to him until he got older. So if Laurent can get him on, I've asked him to just not be just be the artist he is, and tell it like it is about living with a lot of bonobos and chimpanzees, and being an older brother, because now he's going to have to be the voice of Kanzi. He's going to have to speak for Kanzi, and he suddenly found his voice in a way. If we learn how to translate the vocalizations, which we're working on, of the bonobos, we can give lots of apes their voice. We can probably give whales their voice. We can probably give dogs their voice, because there's a few little translation things that have to be learned. But for right now, I'd like to give Shane a chance to just be Kanzi's voice. And I thank you all for taking the time to listen to me. Thank you.
Most of us, for most of us, knowing ourselves is a deep mystery, and knowing somebody else is even more of a mystery. Many of us don't really understand why we do a lot of what we do. So for me to speak for Kanzi would be kind of difficult, but I think one thing he would have been saying for the past at least 13 years, 10 years is get me out of here. As everyone wants some freedom. And I regret very much that I was ever part of anything that resembled a lock ward for any bonobo. And it should never have that. It should have been a familial environment. Kanzi was my brother. I was, I don't know, 14 or so when he was born. And it was a couple of years before I met him. So it wasn't formative years for me, but they sure did shape me. And I know shape Kanzi too. We cooked together, we cleaned together, we hiked together, we climbed trees together, we foraged, got blackberries and stuff together. We cruised in the van, just cruising around together on 50 acres of land. We napped, we hung together. We did everything together. And, I want to thank Laurent for giving us this opportunity to talk about it a little bit. It's felt a little bit, well, I don't know if I want to say that. I don't want to be too negative, but I want to talk about the voice for a second. Some of you heard me, unfortunately, probably talking about being sick. And I was very sick this past year. And I was in a hospital for 2.5 months out of the last year in real bad shape. And I'm glad to be here, but part of it, part of a result of that is I had some nerve damage in my head. I lost my voice. My voice sounds probably strained to you now, but I lost it just about completely. And I was in a lot of pain. I was in a hospital room, and people would come in, they'd talk about me. I'm lying right there. but on account of I can't speak, they could decide whether, to treat me like the armchair or a piece of furniture or a sentient being. Well, I was very sentient. I knew everything that was going on. And I'd try and get a piece of paper and scribble and wave my hands, 2 or 3 doctors and maybe a family member in the room discussing me, but I couldn't say anything. And I realized exactly how Kanzi and Pam Benicia felt, how the bonobos felt. It was palpable at that point, and it was kind of hard to take, frankly. And I can't remember who it was that said because he was so creative. Maybe it was Nancy. He had to be creative. He didn't have enough lexicograms to say the things he wanted to say. Imagine if you only had 300 words. You have to be pretty selective. I always wish that he could have helped make up some more vocabulary there. But this whole notion of, I don't want to ramble too much, but this important, I guess you'd call it discovery, which was always so obvious to me, being lost, or scientists arguing over his little definitions, parsing this and parsing that. I think Paul's got it right. They're arguing over these things, and will it be, lost or discovered? You only have to go online and look at the videos before Kanzi, you got taken over by what was essentially jailers and people wearing masks and things being done differently. Nobody going in with them or being in with them. So not only locked up, nobody even goes inside. You don't hug them or anything like that. And by the way, my mom showed her fingers. I got 10, fingers here. I never had my digits bit off, and I grew up around apes. So what's up with that? If they're so dangerous, how come I'm not missing anything? You had to be creative. Didn't have enough words. And I have another thing I'd like to say about the intelligence of chimps and bonobos just in general. I don't know, like it just came out. I heard this thing on recently. Oh, it's come out that they have theory of mind. Wow, they actually know they're not, that there's other people or other things that think other stuff. Like that's some big revelation. That's just come out. I was stunned, stunned by that. Sherman, who was the Pantroglodytes, one time, Mom and I were outside of the LRC, and he was in the wire inside, and he wanted me to come put my back up so he could tickle with me. And there was something in his eyes and the way he was moving. I said, I don't think that's going to work so well. And my mom said, oh no, he'll be okay. And I said, Sherman, are you going to bite me? Because you look like you're a little pissed. And he said, no, he wasn't on the keyboard. And so she's like, yeah, go ahead and put your back up. Well, sure enough, he bit me. I took a little plug out of my back. And, can you really lie if you don't have theory of mind? If you don't have anything even approaching language? Because he flat out lied to me, lied to her with the keyboard. And, Kanzi definitely is not a genius. Maybe Pam Benicia was. And I'm glad that somebody brought her up, because this should be a service for her too. I loved her very much, and she was very sensitive and very soulful. The picture of Kanzi's looking right at you, and that's the way he was. He was a lot of fun. He was very direct. He had a sense of humor, and he was such a boy, But Pam Benicia, looking at her, she's looking way off somewhere else through you. She saw things very deeply, and she had a kind of a wisdom and a presence, and you could feel it when she played the piano there. We didn't have great audio, but you go look at Pam Benicia grooming song, you'll feel it. If you're if you're feeling sensitive individual, you don't have to be a poet or an artist to pick up on it. I don't know if I have too much more to say, but I love Kanzi very much. I miss him very much, and I miss Pam Benicia. And this research may not get revived anytime soon, because people are afraid of apes. You know, and it shouldn't be a reason to discount its significance because it's too hard to do. You know, the science, it's too hard to do that experiment, so we're not going to try. It's too messy. That doesn't mean that it doesn't have validity and it's not real and it's not right. But I think Kanzi would have said, you know, get me out of here, and now thank God I'm free.